Good afternoon. We are just gathering. We'll give folks just a second. Welcome to this monthly policy update. Again, I want to welcome you to Independent Sector's November monthly policy update. I'm Ben Kershaw. I'm the Director of Government Relations here at Independent Sector. This update is focused on the 2024 election and what's next for the charitable sector, although there's certainly plenty happening right now as well. So I'm joined today by my steadfast government relations colleague, Travis Swanson, on the independent sector team, and by Heather Mead, who's a principal at our close partner, Washington Council, Ernst & Young. For those of you who are joining us for the first time on an IS webinar, I want to welcome you. Independent Sector is a national membership organization made up of nonprofits and foundations and corporate giving programs working to ensure that all people living in the United States thrive. This is a webinar, so your lines are muted. We encourage you to put questions into the Q&A function at any time. General banter and comments are welcome in the chat as well. I'll note that this webinar is a monthly benefit for independent sector members. If you are not with an independent sector member organization, we're still glad to have you here today. Please feel free to be in touch with membership at independentsector.org if you want to keep tuning in month after month for all this goodness. Before we start on a serious note, I want to respectfully acknowledge I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C. It's the ancestral home of the Piscataway people who are still in the area working to reclaim their land and their traditional practice. Also, a lot of the buildings and places that we inhabit in Washington, D.C. were built by enslaved people. Wherever you're joining us from today, we're glad to have you. There's a lot going on. And I'm thrilled to have Heather Mead with us today to walk us through some of the recent election developments and what they might mean both for legislation impacting the charitable sector this year and in 2025. So with that, I'll turn it over to Heather as we pull up her slides for her. Thanks again for being with us today, Heather Mead.
Oh, thank you, Ben. I really appreciate your kind introduction and the opportunity to be with everyone today to walk through a topic that has been hard for most of us to avoid. But I wanted to cover some of the election outcomes, not because we don't know what they are, but because they'll have some very specific implications for us in our sector. And in the work that we do. So if we could flip to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think we lost a slide on that. There we go, thank you. Flip to the next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about the outcomes and focus on the ratios for just a minute. You know, as we saw, this was the first time that a Republican president since 2004 had won both the popular vote, taking all of the battleground states. This has resulted in a real lift for both congressional Republicans and Senate Republicans as they exceeded the margins necessary to take both the House and Senate in 2025. A lot of the focus was on how strong the Republican turnout was, but I do want to focus just for a minute on also how narrow the win was in these particular congressional outcomes. So most of the sort of expected outcomes in the Senate flowed the way we expected them to. Democrats had a very difficult uphill battle with a large number of vulnerable members who are up for re-election. Senate Republicans had very few or to no members in battleground states who were up for re-election, and that resulted in a number of losses in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Montana, and as expected in West Virginia. That really gives Republicans 3 votes that they can lose in order to move things forward. They will also, in a tie situation, have the benefit of the vice president's vote. That's going to be really important when we talk about some of these nominations. And it's also why we saw the potential nominee for the Department of Justice step down today, because even with 3 or 4 members opposed, it becomes very difficult to move things in the Senate. As a reminder, in the Senate, outside of the reconciliation process, you need 60 votes. That means that still, even in this environment, you are still going to need a substantial number of Democrats to vote along with Republicans in order to move legislation forward outside of the budget process, which is a majority vote process, outside of the nominations process, which is a majority vote process, and outside of the reconciliation process that we'll mention later. So really, a lot of the things that we typically do outside of those processes are still going to require bipartisan cooperation. In the Senate, when we sort of moving out of the Senate and over to the House, we're still trying to figure out exactly how big of a majority Republicans are going to have in the House in 2025. We have a number of outstanding, I think it's down to 4. So they have, could have maybe a 5-seat or a 4-seat majority. They have a number of members that are left their seats to move into the administration, or will once they have official nominations and official transition process. We do expect some of the outstanding seats that are remaining out. For example, Steele in California is slightly trending towards the Democrat. Some of the other outstanding seats in California are trending towards the Republican. So we will probably see we might see a split in those outstanding seats, leaving the House with a fairly narrow margin again to deal with. This means that individuals who are gone for particular reasons can affect their ability to move things forward, and a very small group of members, whether they're moderates or conservatives, have the ability to slow progress in the House, even with the takeover of all 3 branches of government in 2025. So this will be important for us as we look to move our priorities in the next Congress and make sure that our voices are heard. Next slide, please. Just a few notes. I wanted to share sort of where we are. We did have an announcement this morning. Gates did his first official round of visits on the Hill yesterday in the Senate. And unfortunately for him, it was clear that he did not have the votes necessary to be able to move out of the Senate in a nomination process. So he has pulled himself out of the Attorney General race. We'll have a new nomination there. But there are obviously the White House Chief of Staff is not an appointed position, is not a nomination. Same for all of the sort of press secretaries. But a large number of these are expected to be able to move through the Senate fairly quickly. Individuals like Elise Stefanik and Marco Rubio are known and respected in the Senate and are expected to be able to move. Others may have a more challenging process. For example, the Director of National Intelligence and a few others, they're still counting votes to see if they'll be able to move some of them forward. But probably one of the more controversial ones has already moved on. So we'll be watching to see how this unfolds. As a reminder, this process will start fairly quickly after January 20th. And we expect to see several of these nominees already in place by mid to the end of February. Next slide. I will note that we don't have the Department of Treasury yet. We're still waiting for that one to come in. We have had leadership elections in the House and Senate. We have listed here our new slate of Republican leadership. I will note that Democrats, after we made these slides, also had their leadership elections. There were no changes in the Democratic leadership. All representatives were renominated to their original posts and will continue to serve in those roles. When it comes to our Senate and House leadership, we do have some individuals that have expressed and continue to be champions for us on a lot of our tax-exempt issues. I will note here, for example, that Senator Langford, who's been a longtime champion of the sector, will remain in the role of the vice chair of the Republican Conference in 2025. Next slide. So just a little bit of an a walkthrough of what we expect to happen next, and we can talk about a few of the things that are on the table here for us. Congress is sort of wrapping up before they go out on their Thanksgiving recess. They left in October with a lot of to-dos on their list, and they're leaving for Thanksgiving with a lot of to-dos on their list. So, for example, there are must-dos like disaster relief package. They're trying to move through the Senate. They need to fund the government by December 20th. We'll talk a little bit about that and what's going on. They still haven't passed the National Defense Authorization Act, the Farm Bill. There are a lot of healthcare provisions that are expiring that have to be addressed by the end of the year. So they still have a lot of big decisions that need to be made. One of the things that is slowing this down is that congressional Republicans are awaiting input from the president-elect. How long and how big should that funding package be? These are things that they don't have insights into yet, and it's really slowed down the decision-making process in Congress. There have been some that were planning for a year. There are some that are planning for 3 months. We need to be able to reach consensus on that fairly quickly after this Thanksgiving recess if we're going to make sure that the government is funded at the end of December. We've moved through the Republican leadership. As a reminder, that date for the expiration of government funding is December 20th. That is the goal target date for determining how long the government will be funded. House Republicans still interested in a 3-month package. Senate Republicans and Democrats interested in a year-long package. We'll see where this ends up. Again, awaiting input from that transition team. January 3rd is the date where Congress will come back in and the new Congress will reconvene. And then the 20th is the date that we'll actually see the new president sworn into office. As a reminder, though, there are a lot of things that are expiring in 2025, and congressional Republicans are hoping to get a jump on some of those items. Tax reform is at the top of that list, and some of those activities are already starting. Let's flip to the next slide. So just because they are funding the government, though, right, I think as we think through what next year looks like, they're interested in starting this conversation about tax reform and utilizing their new authorities to use that budget process I mentioned, where they only need a majority vote of the Republicans to move legislation through Congress. That's the reconciliation process. But there are a couple of tricky things that are also going to jump up and affect the congressional schedule next year. One of these is the debt limit. As a reminder, this actually expires on January 1st. So we have the government funding expiring on December 20th, and then we have the debt limit jumping back in and biting us on January 1st. We do expect the extraordinary measures, which is basically the government using its credit card to pay its credit card, they will be able to use those extraordinary measures until sometime in the second quarter of 2025. Congressional Republicans are thinking that this might be a May-June timeframe action. But that is something that they will likely seek to have addressed on a bipartisan basis. There is a lot of new focus on the debt limit, as some of the priorities that congressional Republicans have listed would be very costly and will require offsets. In particular, the tax bill itself will require billions of dollars in offsets if they want to offset that package, or it would constitute a fairly significant increase in our federal debt. So these will be discussions that congressional Republicans will be engaging in throughout the recess and into early next year. Let's see. Let's move on to the next slide, because I want to make sure we have time for all of our conversation and for your questions. I wanted to flag that this is something that we've been hearing a lot about in the news. So just making sure that you're aware of what it is and what it can do as you look at the priorities that you and your organizations have been working on during the Biden administration. One of the things that Congress can do when they have control of both the House and the Senate is they can utilize what is called the Congressional Review Act. This allows Congress to go back and overturn a final agency rule if it was finalized within 60 legislative days after the publication of the rule. So when a new Congress comes in. this means that they can really look back until kind of the end of the summer timeframe and look at any rules since August that have been finalized to determine whether or not they want to overturn them. So, for example, there was a rule that required a certain number of nurses to be available, in senior centers. That is likely to go away. Some of the overtime rules, things like that they're sort of looking at, could be potential targets in this 60-day time frame. Next slide. The other thing that we're expecting to see pretty early on, this is something that we tried to use in the last administration to drive our conversations. There are a couple of things that tend to happen during this process. One are memos into the transition team, where you try to guide them to align their policies to yours and to consider your issues as they set up their shop. And then the first thing that the president typically does is he sort of starts to provide us with some examples of how they expect to govern by first pulling back all of the executive orders of their predecessor and then issuing their own. This is something that can be done unilaterally by the president, but it does not actually have the force of law. It is really just a direction to agencies to enact policies in line with the orders that have been given by the president. And so there are typically timeframes, recommendations, reports, et cetera, that are aligned with these. And we do expect President Trump to lean heavily into executive orders. He has been talking a lot about this on the campaign trail. For example, trade is an area where he has the ability to unilaterally apply tariffs. That's one area where we may see early executive orders. Immigration is another where he has promised a number of different day one executive orders, and where he does have the ability to make some unilateral decisions without input from Congress. The other is energy. We are expecting a number of energy standards and rollbacks to come out in the form of an executive order, and also in the healthcare space, where he has indicated a number of efforts to pull back on things like diversity programs, equity inclusion programs, and gender policies that have been implemented during the Biden administration. So this will be one of the first areas of activity in the new administration. Do I have one more slide, Ben, or is that the last one?
I think we got one more.
One more.
I could be wrong. Maybe I just don't want the show to end.
Okay. Or you do.
So,
yeah.
Heather, I want to thank you very much. You ready to move to questions, or?
Yeah, let's move to questions.
Great. So we do have one question submitted. Before we get to that, you mentioned executive orders, and one thing that comes to mind is all of the Biden administration day one and month one executive orders around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I remember late in the first Trump administration, some anti-DEI executive orders. Is that another place where we expect to see some action early on?
I do expect to see the administration revisit those types of proposals. They viewed those as a successful part of their campaign. And I do expect to see them both revisit those positions and also work to address those areas where the Biden administration included DEI requirements, both in regulations and hiring proposals and labor proposals and a number of different areas. I do expect to see them try to pull those back where they're able to do so.
Thank you. Something to watch. So we have the question around grants and all the federal money that's been dispersed from the federal government, specifically the Inflation Reduction Act. Heather, can you talk a little bit about sort of how much of that money, at what stage in the process that money can be clawed back, and maybe even some of the creative ideas that the Trump administration is considering?
Yeah, I think Also, this is an area where the Biden administration has been very vocal that they're working very hard to commit, right? They actually have to have a signed contract that has begun in order to have those funds be obligated. This is particularly true. I'm thinking about energy programs, right? There's a lot of funding for energy programs and renewable energy specifically that was part of the IRA. I think they're working very hard to try to obligate as many of those dollars as possible. As you mentioned, there's some creative thinking on the part of the Trump administration about ways to get that back. There's also a lot of thinking about pulling back anything that is unspent as part of the tax reform process in order to generate revenue to offset some of the tax cuts that they're interested in both extending and new ones that they're interested in creating. And so I think anything that hasn't been obligated, particularly in some of the more politically fraught spaces, we could see being repurposed in a new administration. Just also as a reminder, once the money has been allocated in the federal government, there are constraints on how that money can be spent. So in the appropriations process, right, typically it is, given to a specific program. There are limitations on how that money can be either transferred or reprogrammed internal. And it has to really be back within that same program. That it's much easier to do prioritization than it is to do reallocations all the way into another program. However, most of the oversight that would typically be expected for bad behavior like that may be somewhat limited given the Republican congressional makeup. It is very hard for them to claw money back once it has been sent out. So I do not expect a lot of that. There was a lot of thinking about the Trump administration, in particular, some of the state COVID funds that had not been spent. There was a lot of interest in trying to claw those back in creative ways. But I think if you have already received your grant dollars, they're very unlikely to come and ask for those dollars back. It's more new dollars and the process for sending them out the door.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, so that gets to a question we got in the chat about funding granted to nonprofits, and right, that keyword is obligated, right? If it's obligated, it's seems like it's safe. So I want to pause for further questions. Heather, I had one more. So you noted that Congress is going to be sworn in on January 3rd, but the new administration doesn't start until the 20th. They've been talking about moving tax reform quickly. Will it be waiting on his desk for him when he gets to Pennsylvania Avenue?
He wishes. I mean, it's a really good question, Ben, because as you and I know, the committees have been talking about this for a year, right? Like they've been, rubbing their fingers together and starting their planning process. But, I think you and I have both lived through several rounds of reconciliation. And I will tell you, at the start of every reconciliation bill that I have seen in the last 20 years, there is always great optimism at the beginning that it will be a quick and painless process. And then months later down the road, we're still waiting for both the quick and the painless part to be true. There are some very optimistic members of Congress who are hoping to do this in like the first 3 months. But as a reminder, you first have to do a budget package, right? They have to know, they have to give rules to the committees for how much money they can spend and how much money they have to save in a package. And then the committees themselves actually put together the legislative text, and then they have to get agreement on what's in that text, and then they have to pass it out. So even just passing that first budgetary step will take time. My guess is that you and I could be back wearing flip-flops again before they're able to move something forward in the summer timeframe. They're certainly hoping to have it wrapped up by the spring, but this is something that I can see, certainly moving on into, to the warmer and potentially cooler months of next year.
Thank you. So, Heather rightly notes that there's ample potential for delays. And, I think a lot of us who are, girding for next year are, sort of rooting for a slower process, both, kind of for the sake of our holiday plans and for, the chance to have greater input on it. I'll just note for folks that, we're also really cognizant that at every step of the process, whatever the cake is harder to change the more baked it gets. And so we will be working early in the year to try to position our priorities as well as we can. Because that's kind of right, that's the best time, the time when things are most flexible before they gel. We have a question about legislation that was passed earlier this morning, and we certainly will get to that. I want to be clear on that. I will invite folks to ask questions about any of the other stuff Heather has covered, and this won't be your last crack at these topics either. But questions about the 2024 election or the leadership in the various chambers, some of the priorities or expected Trump executive orders.
We've got one question about AmeriCorps funding, Ben, that I'm happy to just flag. I think, this is a really good question. We've seen a number of congressional Republicans really trying to push back on the AmeriCorps program and raising questioning the value of specific programs. I'm thinking specifically of the Education and Workforce Committee. While the chairwoman there is stepping down and we'll have a new chairman and they're not the appropriators for this funding, you can certainly, if you're asking for clues, see kind of a negative narrative developing there for some of them. And sometimes that does sort of spill over into the funding discussions. I think the other thing that we didn't talk about and that I didn't have on the list as a nomination is our new DOJ department, which is not actually a department, but they will continue to have very real influence in government in both recommending congressional actions. There is a whole framework that has been set up. There are congressional Republicans who are now liaisons to the DOJ department. And there are a number of congressional committee Republicans who in specific subject matter areas will be working with the department. And so you can see already kind of that direct line between Congress and, the efforts to cut the government, starting to align a little bit. And I think that, should raise concerns for all of us as we think about funding, and it's just a good reminder that we'll want to continue to talk about the local impacts of our work and our local relationships with our members of Congress on both sides of the aisle as they work through the appropriations process. And it will continue to be important for us to do that, just as it was this year, next year.
I know that you mentioned transition memos and the independent sector, as we did in previous administrations, is writing one to this incoming administration. It's not issued yet, but certainly some of the topics that folks have mentioned today, I expect to be included in Dr. Watkins' note to President-elect Trump and his administration. So I want to move us on. Again, I think Heather can stick around for a few. You're welcome to lob questions to her or for her to bail us out on other questions that we can't answer. As we have gotten a question, I'll be sure that we will share out a recording of this and we will make slides available as well. So we're going to move on to other updates on critical policies that are moving forward and happening, today, as was noted. So earlier today, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 9495. The title of that legislation is the Stop Terror Financing and Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act. So as its title notes, this legislation has some non-controversial provisions in it, postponing tax deadlines for Americans who are wrongfully detained in a foreign country. Uh, it also contains a very controversial section, Section 4 of that legislation, which establishes a new authority for the US Secretary of the Treasury to designate organizations as terrorist supporting organizations. Now, those organizations will lose their tax exempt status. They're given an opportunity to refute or to cure that designation. If it's done to the satisfaction of the secretary, they can keep their status. The secretary can withhold information from that notification for national security purposes. And so independent sector strongly supports stopping bad actors from using our sector to support terrorism or any other activity that is already unambiguously illegal. However, designating organizations as terrorist supporting without first presenting evidence and giving them a chance to make their case and to see that evidence is, we believe, a perversion of due process rights of nonprofit organizations, and indeed runs counter to the existing process for numerous nonprofits that have in recent years lost their tax exempt status because the IRS found that they were supporting terrorism. So independent sector strongly opposed this legislation. We were certainly not alone in doing so amongst nonprofit sector organizations. But that legislation did pass the House of Representatives this morning. It failed to pass the House of Representatives last week under the same text, but an expedited procedure. And so my colleague Travis Swanson has been following the ins and outs of that vote really quickly. So I do want to turn it over to him to tell us a little bit more about how the vote went today, and then to add other updates on other critical nonprofit issues as we've got them. Hey, Travis.
Sure. Thank you, Ben. And before I jump into how the vote went, I just wanted to add one more critical piece of context to what you had said about how there was the non-controversial provisions and the controversial provision. This bill did come to the floor as a closed rule, meaning there was no opportunity to amend it. So that's why there was no effort made to amend it, because as a closed rule, that's just not an option. But moving into the vote, as Ben said, there was a vote on the 12th of this month, as well as again on the 21st today. So that's two votes less than 10 days apart on the same bill with the same text. The first vote ended with a vote of 256 to 145 in favor. As Ben said, that vote failed because it required a higher than simple majority threshold. It required a supermajority threshold for passage. So that's why that vote failed through that rush procedure. Today, the bill passed 219 to 184. Since this came under regular order, this bill did not require that supermajority. So even though it got lower or fewer votes in favor, that it did still pass. In the first vote, 52 Democrats broke rank with their party and voted yes on the bill, while one Republican broke rank with their party and voted no on the bill. This time around, only 15 Democrats broke rank, voting yes on the bill, and one Republican broke rank with the party to vote no on the bill. What's really notable about today's vote is that 34 Democrats who voted yes on the first vote 9 days ago voted no today on that second vote. And that is a huge number considering how close these votes were together, only 9 days apart. None of these 34 Democrats spoke during the debate this morning to explain why they changed their vote. However, during the debate manager was Congressman Lloyd Doggett, a Democrat from Texas, who said that, who did explain part of this reasoning on the floor. And he said many Democrats are changing their votes because they heard from 300 organizations, many of whom are on this call right now, about why this approach won't work and why it will harm the nonprofit and charitable sector. He emphasized in his remarks that lawmakers have an obligation to listen to their constituents and vote accordingly. And that's why so many members are changing their votes, that it doesn't have to do with them just being flip-floppers. It doesn't have to do with the outcome of the election. It has to do with them listening to their constituents and listening to the people who are on the front lines, the people who signed those letters, and those 300 organizations, as I said, many of whom are on this call right now. And so I think that's really important to note, is just how valuable those sign-on letters are, that when we send those around, that we're not just sending them around just to have to keep people busy, that these have meaning. These lawmakers are reading them, they are seeing them. And we got 34 members of Congress who went on record just 9 days ago in support of this, to go on record today saying, you know what, I was wrong 9 days ago. And that is incredibly rare to get even one member of Congress to do that, much less 34 of them in such a short period of time. So really want to thank everybody for signing these letters and reaching out to your lawmakers about this bill. Speaking of sign-on letters, to transition topics, the Charitable Giving Coalition is circulating a letter right now urging Congress to restore the charitable deduction for non-itemizers. I know this isn't a new topic for most of you, and there have been other letters circulating. So this letter, the coalition is planning to send to Congress on December 3rd, which is also Giving Tuesday. As you know, as Heather was just talking about, beginning as early as January, tax reform discussions are set to begin. And we want to make sure Congress continues to hear loud and clear that this issue is important and needs to be included in any of these tax reforms, restoring the charitable deduction. So please consider signing this letter. The deadline is Monday, December 2nd, which sounds like it's far away, but it's much closer than it appears, especially with the holiday next week. And we will drop a link in the chat for that sign on. And then lastly, the last thing I wanted to talk about was the overtime rule, which we have talked about on several calls over the past few months. But there is an update. As you may have seen, on November 15th, a federal court in Texas did strike down the Department of Labor's recent rule raising salary threshold requirements for overtime. And the court ruled that the Department of Labor exceeded their statutory authority in 3 ways. 1, by setting the salary thresholds too high. 2, by creating an automatic updating mechanism. And 3, prioritizing salary job duties in determining exemptions. This decision nullifies both the July 1st increase as well as the planned January 1st increase, as well as all of the scheduled automatic increases. Employers may need to reconsider their adjustments that were made under the now invalid July rule. But please do note that states with higher thresholds, those remain unaffected, and there are several states. I will try to list them, but definitely check your state laws before you do things. I believe it's Alaska, California, New York, Washington State, and Colorado who have higher thresholds. So if you're in any of those states, or really in any state, just please be sure you're checking your state laws. Remember, those state laws remain unaffected by this ruling. The Department of Labor could continue to appeal this decision, but with the upcoming administration change, further action is uncertain. I have not yet seen anything about if the incoming Trump administration intends to pull back and not defend this. I would imagine that that is the case, but have not seen that confirmed yet. So employers should just continue to watch for future updates and stay informed about potential changes to your federal and state salary rules. And I welcome any questions on any of these topics. And thank you, Manuel, for dropping that link into the chat.
Questions about the overtime regulations, about the charitable deduction? I do see we have some questions about the bill of the hour. So we're happy to move to those. So there's one question about the definition of terrorist in the bill that passed the House. And we're happy to include the bill text in this legislation. Importantly, this is not our policy area of deepest expertise, but there are statutes about terrorist organizations, and there are statutes about terrorist supporting organizations. And those are, those are at times different things. So this legislation defines a terrorist supporting organization as any organization designated by the secretary. I would personally underscore that part of this definition, as having provided during the 3-year period material support or resources to an organization described as a terrorist organization elsewhere in the tax code. So that's the definition of a terrorist supporting organization in this bill. And we also got a question about whether this will move to the Senate or whether it will be something for next year. Given the strong pushback against this legislation this week and previously, we would be shocked to see Democratic leader Schumer dedicate any floor time to this, or for it to try to move by unanimous consent. We will remain vigilant, as I know will many others. But again, given the controversial nature of Section 4, even attaching it to something moving in the last minute, again, seems like something we need to be vigilant for, but would be extremely surprising. So like all bills, on January 3rd, it will die and need to be reintroduced and readvanced. As Heather well described for us, the Ways and Means Committee has a lot of things it wants to do early next year. And so it remains to be seen whether efforts like this would fall, where they would fall in that priority list. We also have a question about the Johnson Amendment, and that's code for the long-standing, decades-old firewall between 501c3 charities and partisan political campaigns, right? Essential to the integrity of our sector. The 2017 tax legislation tried to significantly weaken, water down, some might even say void that firewall in language that passed the House version of the 2017 tax bill. Important to note that that language did not make it into the final version of the bill because it was deemed ineligible for the reconciliation procedure being used to pass it. They're going to use that same procedure to pass legislation in 2025. So whether they try to find a different way to do it, or whether they try to change the person who's making the decisions about whether it's eligible for the reconciliation process or not, remains to be seen. But we are under no illusion that the forces that want to repeal that longstanding provision have given up. Questions about the struck down overtime regulations, about charitable giving, about the rest of this year or next year? I want to again thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Heather Mead. Thank you, Travis Swanson. Thank you, Manuel Gomez. And thank you to all of you for the work you're doing day in and day out. We know we'll all be in touch. Take care.
Thank you.